Somewhere right now, there's a number attached to your name. It might be in a 401k, it might be a pension, it might be a social security statement sitting in a drawer you've never opened. And whatever form it takes, that number represents a promise that one day you will be allowed to stop working, not because you're sick, not because you were fired, just because you got old. Think about how strange that is. For almost the entire history of human labor, there was no such promise. You worked, and then you worked some more, and then your body gave out and you became a burden on somebody, your children, your church, your county, or you became a burden on nobody because there was nobody, and you died. Those were the options. That was the whole list. The first private pension plan in the United States was created in 1875. 1875. That's 10 years after Appomattox. Ulysses S. Grant was president. And in the entire 100-year history of the American Republic up to that point, no company had ever said to a worker, when you are too old to do this, we will keep paying you anyway. Not one. The idea simply did not exist. Now someone is already typing in the comments, what about Civil War pensions? And they'd be right, sort of. The federal government did pay veterans, and after Congress broadened eligibility in the 1890s, those payments became one of the largest transfer programs any government in the world was running. But look at what it was paying for. It paid you for having been shot at, for a wound, for a widow, for service in uniform. What it did not do, what nothing in America did, was pay you for the ordinary, unglamorous act of surviving 40 years of work. America was perfectly willing to pay you for surviving a war. It just wasn't willing to pay you for surviving a job. So that raises 3 questions, and this video answers all 3 in order. First, what actually happened to old workers before 1875? Not in theory, in practice. When a 58-year-old man woke up and found he couldn't grip a brake wheel anymore, what happened to him that afternoon? Second, why the railroads? Of every industry in America, banking, textiles, steel, mining, why did the pension get invented by men who worked on trains? And third, what went so catastrophically wrong with the thing they built that the federal government had to seize the entire system and run it itself? To answer that, we have to go back to a time when growing old in America wasn't a stage of life. It was a crisis. Because this isn't really a story about money. It's a story about power, about who gets to decide when a body is finished, about what a company owes a person it used up, and about who was allowed to grow old with dignity and who was quietly left off the list. In the 1870s, an old worker in America had exactly 3 doors in front of him. Door 1, you work until you die. And that's not a figure of speech, it's a description. Men in their 70s were still on shop floors, still on docks, still on section gangs, doing work that was openly killing them, because there existed no mechanism by which they could stop. Retirement wasn't a choice people declined. It was a thing that did not exist to be chosen. Door 2, your children take you in. This required that you had children, that they survived to adulthood, that they had room and income to spare, that they lived close enough to reach in an era of mass migration, and that they were willing. 5 conditions, each of which could fail independently. And even when the chain held, it came with the daily arithmetic of being a mouth somebody else has to feed. Door 3 was the poorhouse. I want to slow down here because this is the part that usually gets summarized when it should be shown. Nearly every county had one, and they were almost always built out past the edge of town, out on the county farm, out where nobody had to look at them. That placement wasn't accidental. It was policy. Visible enough to serve as a warning, remote enough to be forgotten. If you ended up there, here's how it went. You'd sell what you had, which by then wasn't much. Someone would drive you out in a wagon, or you'd walk, and you'd stand in front of a clerk and give your name, and he'd enter it in a ledger under a column-headed pauper. In parts of the country, entering that ledger meant losing the right to vote. Your name might be printed in the local paper alongside county expenditures because you were, on the books, an expense. If you arrived with your wife of 40 years, you'd likely be separated at the door because most of these institutions were segregated by sex into separate wards. Men one side, women the other. 4 decades of marriage ended by a floor plan. If you could still stand and lift, you'd be put to work because these places ran on a moral theory that idleness caused poverty and labor was the cure. So a man who'd worked 50 years and was too broken to be employed anywhere would be assigned a task anyway, to correct a character flaw he did not have. And in many counties, when you died there, you went into an unmarked plot on the institution's own ground, no stone, a number in a book. Here's the detail that tells you how deep this ran. These places were built with a particular imagined population in mind. The drunk, the vagrant, the idle. That was the theory. And every time investigators actually walked through them in the late 1800s, they ran into the same uncomfortable fact. They had filled up with the elderly, not criminals, not drifters. Old people, whose entire offense was that they'd aged out of usefulness in an economy that had made no plan for it. And you can measure how far this reached into ordinary life by what the country was reading. In 1871, a poet named Will Carleton published a piece called Over the Hill to the Poorhouse. It's narrated by an old woman being walked to the almshouse, handed from one grown child to the next, each of whom found a reason not to keep her. It became a national phenomenon, reprinted everywhere, memorized, recited in parlors, set to music, eventually filmed. The most famous piece of writing in America about growing old wasn't a policy paper. It was a poem about being abandoned to a public institution, and it was so instantly recognizable that it spawned an entire industry of sequels. That's not a poem. That's a genre. Old age in 19th century America wasn't a demographic category, it was a diagnosis. So that was the country. No safety net, no retirement, no expectation that anyone owed you anything for the years you'd handed over. But in one specific industry, that was about to become mathematically impossible. And not because anyone in charge developed a conscience, because of physics. You have to understand what the railroads actually were because the word company is much too small for it. They were the first true modern corporations in America. By the latter part of the century, individual railroads employed more people and ran more complicated bureaucracies than most branches of government. They invented much of what we now call management: organizational charts, middle managers, written operating rules, company police, their own telegraph networks. They standardized time itself. The time zones you live in exist because railroads needed timetables that worked across a continent, and in 1883 they simply imposed them on the country. And that scale created a problem no employer in history had faced, because it's a problem you can only have if you employ hundreds of thousands of people permanently inside one organization for the whole span of their adult lives. They had an aging workforce in one place, on the books, visible. A farm absorbs an old man. He does less. He mends harness. He watches the children. He sits at the edge of the field. The economic unit is a family, and families flex. A 3,000-mile logistics operation running on split-second coordination does not flex. There is no lighter version of standing on top of a moving freight car in the dark. And now I have to tell you what this work did to human bodies, because the pension makes no sense without it. Before automatic couplers, joining two rail cars was done by hand with a device called a link and pin coupler. One car carries a socket. A heavy iron link hangs out of it. To connect the next car, a brakeman had to step between the two cars as they were pushed together, guide that link into the opposing socket, and drop an iron pin through it at exactly the right instant. He was standing in the closing gap between two moving objects weighing many tons each, using his bare hands, on loose gravel, frequently at night, frequently in rain, frequently on ice. Get the timing slightly wrong and it takes your fingers. Get it more wrong and it takes your hand or your arm. Get it completely wrong and it takes you. There was a way to tell whether a man worked the yards. You looked at his hands. Missing fingers weren't an accident on the railroad. They were a credential, and the coupler was only half of it. Before air brakes came into general use, stopping a freight train meant sending men onto the roofs of the cars while the train was still moving, to run along the tops and turn brake wheels by hand, coordinating by whistle signal, in the dark, in snow, on wet, canted, moving surfaces, ducking bridges and tunnel mouths that would take a man's head off if he misjudged the clearance by a foot. The Interstate Commerce Commission began collecting accident statistics in the late 1880s, and the numbers became a political scandal. Thousands of railroad employees killed every single year, tens of thousands maimed, in an industry that by modern standards wasn't even especially large. And the risk was wildly concentrated by job. If you were a brakeman, your odds were dramatically worse than the industry averages implied. It got bad enough that Congress passed the Safety Appliance Act in 1893, mandating automatic couplers and power brakes, one of the first times the federal government told private industry how it was permitted to treat the human beings inside it. Now take those annual rates and run them across a 30-year career, because a per-year injury rate always sounds survivable. That's the trick of annual statistics. Compound them across a working life, and the number stops describing a risk and starts describing a schedule. The question was never whether the railroad would take something from you. It was what and when. But here's where the story turns, and it turns colder than you'd expect. The railroads did not invent the pension out of pity. They invented it because an aging brakeman was a derailment waiting to happen. A man with failing eyesight, slowing hands, and 30 years of accumulated damage wasn't simply a worker in decline. On a railroad, he was a moving safety hazard, coupling cars in a crowded yard, reading signal lamps at distance in bad light, making judgments about closing speeds that other men's lives depended on. His decline wasn't a private matter between him and his own body. It was a liability with a locomotive attached to it, so the railroads needed him off the trains. But firing him outright was ugly, and expensively ugly. It demoralized every man in the yard, because every man in the yard could do arithmetic and see himself standing there in 20 years. It looked monstrous in the newspapers, and this was an industry that had just come through the strikes of 1877, which spread across multiple states and had to be put down with federal troops. So the railroads needed a way to get old men off the trains without looking like they were throwing old men off the trains. The pension wasn't a gift. It was a removal mechanism with good manners. And in 1875, the first one appeared at a company that wasn't quite a railroad. The American Express Company was a freight and express business. It moved parcels, valuables, and money, riding on the railroads, which meant its men worked the same yards, the same equipment, and got hurt the same ways. In 1875, American Express established what's generally recognized as the first formal private pension plan in the United States. And the most revealing thing about it is how narrow it was. Getting a pension out of that plan meant passing through a sequence of gates. Gate 1, you had to have reached 60. Gate 2, 20 years of service. Gate 3, you had to be permanently incapacitated, not tired, not slowing down, permanently, demonstrably broken. Gate 4, your manager had to recommend you. Gate 5, the board of directors had to approve it. Clear all 5, and you got a fraction of your average late career pay, roughly half bonus, subject to a hard annual ceiling. Read those gates again and notice what they add up to. This wasn't a retirement plan the way you think of one. It was a disability provision, granted case, by name, by vote. Closer to a company deciding to be kind to a specific man than to a system anybody could rely on. And here's the sentence buried inside it that matters more than every number I just gave you. The pension was structured as a gratuity, a gift, an act of corporate generosity, granted at the company's discretion, creating no legal obligation whatsoever, which means the thing that can be given can also, at any moment and for any reason, be taken. Hold on to that. In 1884, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad established the first major employer-wide plan in American industry, broader, systematic, covering an entire workforce rather than a handful of broken men approved one at a time. From there, the model spread with remarkable speed. The Pennsylvania Railroad, then the largest corporation in the country, adopted one at the turn of the century. Others fell in behind it. By the early 20th century, if you were an American worker covered by any pension plan at all, the odds were overwhelming that you worked on a railroad. This wasn't one industry among several. For decades, railroads essentially were the American private pension system, so something real had changed. Before 1875, growing old at work meant walking out the gate with whatever was in your pockets. After 1875, for some men at some companies, it meant a check. Before 1875, a company's obligation ended the exact moment your usefulness did. After 1875, on paper, it didn't. But let's be precise about what had actually been built. This was not a safety net. A net is stretched under everybody. It doesn't ask who you are before it catches you, and it doesn't require anyone's approval to work. This was a rope, thrown from the deck of a ship. One rope, thrown by hand, at whoever the captain happened to be looking at. Remember that image, we're coming back to it. And for about 40 years, that rope held. Men retired, checks arrived. Companies ran photographs of gray-haired veterans of the line in their employee magazines. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of something decent. It was also the single most effective anti-union weapon American industry had yet invented. Here's why. There was no such thing as vesting. That concept, the idea that after a certain number of years your pension becomes legally yours, something you own and carry with you, did not exist. Your pension existed at the pleasure of your employer, right up until the day it started paying, and in many plans even after. Leave the company at 19 years and 11 months? Nothing. Get fired for cause, and remember, the company defines the cause? Nothing. Go on strike? Nothing. Many plan documents said so explicitly. Participation in a work stoppage was grounds for forfeiture in writing, understood by every man on the property. So picture a man in the yards. He's 54. He's got 16 years in. The union comes through and asks him to walk out, and God knows he wants to. The hours are inhuman. The equipment is killing men he's known since he was 20. The pay has been cut twice. He agrees with every word they're saying, and then he does the arithmetic the company already did for him, years earlier when they designed the plan. 16 years in. 6 to go. And the moment he steps off that line, 16 years of his life converts to 0. So he shakes his head and he stays. Not because he's a company man, because the pension is a hostage, and the company knows exactly where it's being held. That's the first trap. There's a second one, crueler, because it wasn't even intentional. Once a company is on the hook for pensions, older new hires become expensive, so railroads imposed maximum hiring ages, commonly somewhere in the 30s, which meant a skilled man who lost his job at 45 wasn't merely unemployed, he was structurally unemployable, in the only industry he knew, permanently by rule. The system built to protect old workers helped turn being old, in the labor market, into a disqualification. And now the third problem, the one that brings the whole thing down. Almost none of these plans were funded. No trust, no segregated pool of invested assets with a retiree's name on it. Pensions were paid out of current operating revenue. This year's freight receipts paid this year's retirees. The promise made to a 30-year-old brakeman in 1905 was going to be honored, if it was honored at all, with money that hadn't been earned yet, by a company in a form that didn't yet exist, in an economy nobody could see. Which meant every pension promise in America rested on one silent assumption, that the railroads would always be making money. Nobody wrote that assumption down. Nobody thought they needed to. It was just the floor everyone was standing on. And in October of 1929, the floor gave out. The Depression hit the railroads early and hard, because railroads are a leading indicator of everything. When factories stop producing, there's nothing to ship. When people stop having money, they stop traveling. Freight tonnage collapsed. Passenger revenue collapsed. Within a few years, a substantial share of the nation's railroad mileage was in receivership, carriers considered permanent features of the American landscape, the safest bonds in the country, sitting in the hands of the courts, and now watch the machinery work. Revenue fell, which meant railroads couldn't cover pension payments out of operating income because there was no fund to draw from, only income, which meant they cut benefits, which meant they deferred them, which meant they suspended them, which meant they quietly discontinued plans altogether. Which meant men who'd stayed silent for 30 years specifically to protect a promise, watched it be reduced, then postponed, then withdrawn, by companies entirely within their legal rights to do it, because it had never been a promise at all in the legal sense. It had never been a contract. Everyone had simply agreed to behave as though it was. Go back to the man in the yard. It's 1933. He's 62 with 30 years in. He is exactly the man the pension was designed for. Old, used up, loyal, still standing. And there is nothing there. He's a few miles and a few months from the same institution his father would have gone to in 1880. The wagon, the ledger, the pauper column, the unmarked plot on the county farm, nothing has been solved. The rope was never tied to anything, and he'd paid for it with 16 years of silence. He wasn't alone. The destitution of the elderly was one of the defining catastrophes of the early Depression, so visible and so politically combustible that it produced mass movements demanding federal old age payments, movements that alarmed Washington precisely because millions of ordinary, previously apolitical people were signing on by the week. So the railroad brotherhoods made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They stopped asking their employers to fix it. They went to Washington and asked the federal government to take the whole thing over. In 1934, Congress passed the Railroad Retirement Act. This created a compulsory, nationwide, industry-wide retirement system. Not one company's plan, the whole industry pooled. Funded by taxes on carriers and employees. Portable, so your years counted no matter which railroad you worked for. Which meant it was no longer a gift from your employer. It was an entitlement earned by your labor. It followed you, and no manager anywhere could take it away for walking a picket line. The railroad sued immediately. And in 1935, in Railroad Retirement Board versus Alton Railroad Company, the Supreme Court struck the entire thing down, 5 votes to 4, holding that Congress had exceeded its authority to regulate interstate commerce. 1 year. That's how long the first national retirement system in American history lasted before the court took it apart. 5 to 4, 1 vote. The whole architecture of American retirement came down to a single justice's signature on a single opinion. But this was 1935, and Congress was in no mood to be told no. Lawmakers rebuilt the thing on different legal foundations, splitting it into separate taxing and benefits legislation designed to survive review. And then, rather than litigate indefinitely, the government did something quietly remarkable. It put the carriers and the unions in a room together and told them to negotiate the system themselves. What came out was the Railroad Retirement Act of 1937, a durable, funded, federally administered retirement system that still exists today, still run by its own board, still separate from everything else in American social insurance. And note the sequence, because most retellings get it backwards. The Social Security Act was signed in August of 1935. Railroad workers got their national retirement system first, and were then deliberately carved out of Social Security into their own permanent parallel program. Railroaders weren't a footnote to the American welfare state. They were the test case for it. Before 1937, your old age depended on your employer's balance sheet and your supervisor's opinion of you. After 1937, it depended on the United States. Before 1937, it could be revoked. After 1937, it had to be paid. So that's the triumph. 62 years from one company's discretionary charity fund to a national guarantee, won by the very men being fed into the machinery that made it necessary. It's a good story. It's also, in an important way, a lie of omission. Because there was an entire category of railroad worker for whom almost none of this applied, and the reason has nothing to do with economics. I said at the start that this was a story about who was allowed to grow old with dignity and who was quietly left off the list. Here's the part of that sentence I hadn't explained yet. Black men worked the railroads in enormous numbers. They laid and maintained track. They fired boilers. They cooked, portered, cleaned, loaded, and carried. The railroad was one of the largest employers of black labor in the country and one of the few paths to a stable black middle class. And the exclusion worked through three interlocking mechanisms. The first was occupational. Black workers were concentrated in exactly the categories least likely to be covered: service roles, common labor, seasonal work, jobs classified outside the protected operating crafts, while the skilled train service positions, the ones with plans and seniority ladders, were held closed by custom, by contract, and where necessary by force. The second was the unions themselves. The great railroad brotherhoods, the same organizations that marched into Washington and won a national pension system, maintained explicit whites-only clauses in their constitutions for decades, not in formal practice. Written membership bars, adopted by vote, printed in the rule book. The men who built the safety net wrote the exclusion into their own bylaws. That's not a side effect. That's a design specification. And it eventually took litigation reaching the Supreme Court in the 1940s to establish that a union holding exclusive bargaining power owed a duty of fair representation even to workers it refused to admit. The third was discretion. Remember the 5 gates in that original 1875 model: the manager's recommendation, the board's approval. That model governed private pensions for 60 years. A system that runs on one supervisor's opinion is a system that runs on one supervisor's prejudice, and there's no appeals process for an opinion. But here's what happened next, and it's the part that should stay with you. In 1925, the Pullman porters, the black men who made the beds, carried the bags, and absorbed the insults on every sleeping car in America, and who were routinely addressed as George, regardless of their actual names, began organizing under A. Philip Randolph. It took 12 years of firings, spies, and blacklists before the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters won recognition in 1937, the same year the National Railroad Pension System was secured, and that organization became something far larger than a union. Randolph used it to threaten a march on Washington in 1941, pushing Franklin Roosevelt into banning discrimination in defense industries. Its members, its money, and its network ran through the entire Black freedom movement for the next 30 years, porters carrying newspapers, information, and organizers up and down the rail lines of a segregated country. Randolph was the man who called the March on Washington in 1963, and he was the man who introduced Martin Luther King Jr. before he spoke. The men who were locked out of the first American retirement system went out and built the organizing infrastructure of the civil rights movement instead. That is not a consolation prize. It's one of the most extraordinary reversals in American history, and it happened because an industry decided that the men who made its beds didn't count. Now step back and look at how peculiar the American path really is. Germany built a national old age insurance system in 1889 under Bismarck, decades before America had anything. Britain passed its Old Age Pensions Act in 1908. Across industrial Europe, the sequence ran national system first, employer plans second, sitting on top as a supplement. America ran it backwards. Private charity first, corporate discretion for 60 years, and a national guarantee only at the very end, only after a total collapse made every other option unavailable. The American retirement system isn't the product of a philosophy. It's the product of an emergency. We never decided old people deserved security. We simply ran out of ways to avoid the question. And if you think that lesson stuck, watch what happens next. 1963. The Studebaker plant in South Bend closes, and thousands of workers discover the pensions they'd been promised are backed by a fund that can't possibly cover them. Older retirees get most of what they're owed. Men in their 40s and 50s with decades of service get a fraction D or nothing. The exact flaw the railroads built in 1875 takes down another generation. 1974. Congress finally passes ERYSA, funding standards, vesting rules, and a federal insurance backstop for failed plans. A century late, the gratuity model is dismantled by law. And then, beginning in the late 1970s, a quiet migration almost nobody voted on. Out of defined benefit pensions, where the institution carries the risk and owes you a number, into defined contribution accounts where you carry the risk and are owed a balance, which means the number sitting in your account right now, the one I opened this video with, is structurally closer to the 1875 model than the 1937 one. Market performance is your problem. Longevity is your problem. Whether you saved enough, started early enough, and picked correctly is your problem. The rope is back in the captain's hand, and this time the captain is you. So look at that number again. It isn't a fact of nature. It's the residue of a fight between men with missing fingers and companies that needed them off the trains, between a Congress that legislated and a court that struck it down 5 votes to 4, between the people who were on the list and the people deliberately kept off it. Retirement is not something human beings have. It's something a specific group of Americans took from employers who never intended to give it, in an industry that was killing them less than 100 years ago, and things that were taken can be taken back. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps, and I appreciate every one of you who does. And if you want the story of how the other half of this system got built, the video right here is where to go next.